Hey, welcome back, you all. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving break. I'm just going to quickly run over what I'm looking for in that paper that you're all finishing up this week, and then I'll go on and hit the high points of the little chapter on the ontology of art that I gave you to read this week. So what we've been doing is doing a little bit in the metaphysics or the ontology of art. Metaphysics and ontology is the study of the nature of reality and what exists. And the question I've asked you is to give a definition of art. Now, what's a definition? Well, it's something that takes all the different things that are out there in the world, piles of sunflower seeds and sharks and sculptures of chocolate and urinals, and it puts a little line around all the things that are art and gives you some principles to say, look, this is how you determine what things are art and fall in the big circle of stuff that counts as art, and what things are outside of that circle, are not art. And so what we saw the last couple of weeks before the break was that the way that we usually construct definitions is by giving what are called necessary and sufficient conditions on something being art. So if you want to draw a circle around all the things that are art and leave outside of the circle all the stuff that is not art, well, you want necessary conditions that are going to tell you what conditions you have to meet in order to be inside that circle of art. And then sufficient conditions are conditions that are such that, well, as long as you meet those conditions, then that's enough for you to be inside that circle of art. So what I'm looking for you is to either come up with your own definition or borrow some of the definitions of some of the philosophers that we've studied and defend those as the correct definition of art. And in order to do that, you're going to want to consider counterexamples to your definition, some objections about why your definition might not hold up. So, in particular, what you want to think about are two sorts of things. So, first of all, you want to think about stuff that might seem to be art, even though it doesn't meet the necessary conditions that you lay out in your definition. Because remember, necessary condition is supposed to be something that something has to have in order to be art. So, if there's something that's a piece of art, but doesn't meet those conditions, well, then it seems like your definition has left something out. The other thing you should be thinking about are things that seem to meet your sufficient conditions that you lay out in your definition, but that don't actually seem to be art at all. Because again, remember, sufficient conditions are supposed to be such that as long as you've got them, then of course you're art. So if you've got something that meets those sufficient conditions, but it's not actually art, well, then they don't seem like they're actually sufficient conditions on something being art. So I'll just give you a quick example. This would be a really bad definition of art as an example, but you can see why, because you can really easily think up counterexamples to the definition. So here's the little example definition I came up with. So something is art as long as it meets the necessary condition of being a representation, and if it is pretty, then that's sufficient for it to be art. So everything that's pretty is art, and in order to be a piece of art, then you must be a representation. So now, if I want to defend that definition, I'm going to have to say how it can account for a couple of different possible counterexamples. So the first kind of counterexample would be something that seems to be art, even though it doesn't meet my necessary condition of being a representation. So a good example here is Duchamp's fountain. Remember Duchamp's urinal that he put into the museum that Dickey talks about. So Duchamp's fountain certainly seems to be art. Most people consider it to be art, yet it doesn't meet my necessary condition of being a representation. It doesn't seem to be a representation of a urinal. It just is a urinal. It's not representing anything else. So that is something that seems to be art, even though it doesn't meet my necessary condition. Now, if I were to defend my definition, I might try and say, well, actually, the urinal does represent a urinal. Sure, it is a urinal, but maybe there's some reasons to think that it also represents a urinal. And then you'd have to do a fair amount of work to try and make that claim seem plausible. That's going to be tough. That's part of the challenge of writing the essay. But what I want to see is that you recognize that that is a possible counterexample to your definition. So that's one counterexample. The other sort of counterexample I want to think about is stuff that seems to meet the sufficient conditions that I've laid out here, but isn't actually art. So that's pretty easy. You could think of plenty of stuff that's pretty, that meets that sufficient condition of being pretty, but is nonetheless not art. For example, a rose. A rose, some roses at any rate, seem to be pretty, so they meet that sufficient condition, but that's not enough for them to be art. Because most roses just are not art. So if I wanted to defend being pretty as being a sufficient condition on being art, then I'd have to say something about, why all pretty roses are art, even if no one puts them in an art gallery, or even if no one even looks at them. Now that's going to be a tougher order to fill. That's going to be challenging. But again, what I care about is that I see that you're thinking through the strongest possible objections to your definition and then doing your best shot at defending your definition against those counterexamples. So that's my summary of what you're trying to do in these essays. I'm going to look forward to reading them next week. And if you've got any questions about them outstanding, feel free to email me. All right, when I come back, we'll go beyond this metaphysical question about how you divide up the world between the stuff that's art and the stuff that's not art, to this further ontological question where we're going to look at inside the circle, once we've separated out all of the art stuff, and ask, so what kinds of things are those? Like, what is an artist making when they make art? Now, the answer might seem pretty obvious from the get-go, but I'm going to complicate it in the next video for you, and the reading will complicate it for you as well. Okay, I'll be back in a moment.